Our next speaker, another great colleague of mine, this time one from the development team, the mysterious and unknown kind of development team that does their magic and no one really knows, how they look and what they actually do. Well, he's going to talk about some of the new, more advanced trigger functions that we are implementing in 5.2. So let's welcome our developer, Aleksandrs Kalimulins.
Hello, my name is Alex, and I want to talk about the new trigger functions we are introducing in Zabbix 5.2. Let's start with some philosophical observations. In many cases, configuring monitoring entities is pretty straightforward exercise. For example, we know that computers should have some free disk space or applications won't work. We know that CPUs should not run at 100 degrees Celsius. We know that user-facing applications should respond in less than a couple of seconds, otherwise users will notice and complain. If we want to be alerted when any of these expectations fail, we just need to add a trigger, which can be as simple as in this example. However, there are situations when you don't know what is normal and what's not. These are the cases that can be only evaluated in a proper surrounding context. For example, is it okay if your RAM is 70% full? The answer, of course, is our favorite, it depends. If the RAM was just 20% full a week ago, chances are big that some application is leaking and your memory usage will continue growing. But if your RAM usage stays at 70% 3 years in a row, there are even better chances it stays so for another 3 years. Another good example of it depends is web traffic monitoring. Intuitively, we know that it's perfectly normal to have uneven traffic distribution across days of week or months. But every website has its own usage patterns, so even when we figure what's normal and what's not for one specific website, it's difficult to scale this knowledge to other websites. So, in the grand scheme of things, it all boils down to finding a good baseline for parameters we want to monitor. And baselines are usually defined by previous knowledge. So, in such cases, instead of figuring out a fixed threshold, some fixed value or percentage, we need to figure out data points in the past we want to compare to our current data points. Finding the right point in the past, or rather finding a good interval to look back, is still something that the user must apply manually, even though we are also working on automating this in the future. But the new Zabbix 5.2 gives you some tools to make comparisons to baseline way easier. Let's take a closer look at the web traffic monitoring example. This is a history of website visits for an imaginary commerce site, say shopexample.com. The numbers are very different at any given point in time, yet all these are normal in a certain context. Overall, we see a growth trend in 2020 compared to 2019. But there are seasonal traffic spikes. Biggest ones are around Christmas. Site administrators like to be informed on any anomalies, such as fraud traffic, for example, but hate false positives caused by seasonal spikes. If we want to detect anomalies here, we can get an average over some period and then to compare it to an average of the same period from a year ago. If we know that our organic year-to-year growth is not likely to exceed, say, 15%, then it's seemingly easy to do this in virtually any version of Zabbix. Like this, we take an average traffic over 30 days and check if it exceeds the same period from a year ago for more than 15%. But there are quite a few problems with this trigger expression. First, we look 1 year back in the history. But if we look into Zabbix 5.0 documentation about triggers, we see this. Triggers are evaluated based on history data only. This means that we need to keep the full detailed history for at least 1 year, 13 months in this specific case. It is a possible solution if we ingest the traffic data daily, but what if we do it every minute? What if we do it every minute for 1,000 of websites? Second, we specify time as 30D and 365D. As you know, in Zabbix, this is just a fancy way to specify such big number of seconds. Zabbix 5.0 doesn't have time suffix for a month and a year just because this cannot be simply translated to a number of seconds. Even though 30D is very close to 28D and 31D, it's still not the same. Third, the result of average function with or without the second time shift parameter always depends on the specific time of calculation. This is because Zabbix calculates time shift by subtracting interval from the current time. This makes impossible to calculate aggregates between, say, first and last days of week, month, or year. That's why we are introducing the new trigger functions which address all the issues above. We also added few other trigger features which improve event presentation. These functions are similar to the non-trend counterparts, but optimized for baseline monitoring use cases. The new functions use trend tables instead of history, and do not forget to set a proper trend storage period, by the way. Period and period shift parameters use Gregorian calendar instead of number of seconds. They save system resources by calculating these functions only upon the end of a period. In addition to the new trigger functions, we also added the ability to set customized event name. The customized event name lets you to fine-tune how the event looks in the Zabbix UI in screens like problems and problem widgets, and include trigger expression calculation results. This field is optional. You can continue using trigger field name. There is also a new macro brace question mark. It can be used for expressions inside the event name. We will talk about it later. Let's reconfigure our trigger in Zabbix 5.2 style. Please pay attention to the arguments of the new trend average function, 1m and now /m. The first argument says we use calendar months as an aggregation period. So depending on the month, trend average will be doing calculations for it will properly pick up first and the last date of the month. The same goes about other possible interval suffixes, h for hour, d for day, v week, and y year. The second parameter, as in regular aggregate functions, means time shift. But to distinguish between old and new types of shift, we call it a period shift. The period shift denotes the last point in the timeline for our aggregation. For instance, if today is October 13th, then trend average by 1 month will calculate the value from September 1st to September 30, and trend average by 1 month with 1 month minus 1 year will calculate the value from September 1st, 2019 to September 30th, 2019. Now let's have a quick look at the event name field. In Zabbix 5.2, you can continue using the name field whose content will be copied to the event name. But if you specify the event name, it will be used for all corresponding events instead. The event name support new brace question mark macro, so you can put another trigger expression inside this macro to show some related calculations. We call it expression macro. For instance, the event name from the above will be shown like this in the problem screen. It is already very useful, but this percentage looked way better if we could round it up a little. It wouldn't also hurt to show what months we compare our traffic against. For this purpose, we have added two formatting functions. fmtnum is applicable to item value, item last value, and expression macros. fmttime is applicable to time macro, uses strftime format, and as the name suggests, formats time. Let's see how can we improve our event name with the new formatting functions. It looks somewhat scary on the trigger configuration screen, but Zabbix will reward us by generating events like this. But the new functions are not just limited by a single use case of comparing some data points from a recent period to some past period. Let's consider another real-world example. Imagine your IT department runs some very important services in the cloud. And of course, your finance department sends a monthly budget you don't want to overrun. You receive cloud usage records from one or more cloud providers and ingest this data periodically into the monitoring. Of course, you could set up a trigger with a trend sum by 1 month to check whether you exceeded your fixed budget in the previous month or not. But you want to know about the budget overrun SAP. If you exceed your monthly budget in the middle of a month, your quick reaction might save companies money. Let's take a look at this chart. We see the even distribution of cloud usage costs up to the last dates of September, and then the usage starts going up. When should you start worrying? Again, the new trend functions come to the rescue. The solution is to use the period shift parameter, just not in the past, but rather in the future. If today's date is, say, October 22nd, then this expression will calculate sum from October 1st to October 31st. But there is one small problem, though. As I have mentioned earlier, to save precious computing resources, Zabbix evaluates these functions in triggers only when the period is over. However, these functions are also available in calculated items, and we can use arbitrary calculation intervals there. So the solution is to set up a calculated item, use trend sum in a formula, and specify some reasonable update interval, say 1 hour or 1 day. On the right-hand side of the chart, there is the current period, and we see that it's not over yet. Let's take a look at the item definition. This is the formula to calculate the current calendar period. Then we can add a simple trigger referencing this calculated item. And yes, you can also use a new expression macro in this trigger too. You don't need to have trend functions anywhere in the formula for this. On the trigger fired, you will see following problem on the problem screen. A nice and clean message that contains all the information we need. We just looked at a couple of examples, but of course there are many more possible applications for the new functions. Generally, these functions can be applied not only to IT-related metrics, but also to many other real-world KPIs. Just to name a few, business performance to calculate annual revenue, profitability, etc. Sales and marketing, for example, monthly average customer acquisition cost, sales target rate. Some warehousing metrics like weekly shipments, return rates, etc. Human resources, for example, annual training costs, overtime hours, customer support like average response time or number of issues per month. So in a sense, we expect these functions to pave the way for Zabbix to new territories which have been previously occupied by CRMs and other business analytics systems. Just a quick recap of what we have looked at today. Zabbix trend functions is a new way to analyze history without storing lots of historic data. Zabbix trend functions support calendar hours, days, weeks, months, and years. New trigger field event name let us display event with context. New formatting functions let us present numbers and dates in a flexible manner. Long-term data analysis just got easier and better with new Zabbix 5.2. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Aleksandrs, for describing how these new, very interesting and powerful trigger functions do work. But I do have two more questions from our community members about some peculiar kind of details of these here functions. So first off, what's the maximum time period for these new trigger functions? So for how long can we analyze the data?
The maximum time period is not limited by any hard-coded values. The only limit you should keep in mind is just the size of your trend data history. But there are no limitations in code whatsoever that would limit this use. You also should keep in mind that the longer is the period, the bigger the database load. So this also a thing to consider.
Yeah, thank you. This is something that you should always keep in mind. The more data you analyze for the longer period, the higher the performance impact. And the second question, so is this trend data that we're analyzing, is it also going to be stored in the value cache or some other place?
It's not stored in the value cache at the moment. These trigger functions recalculate its values only after the period is over. So it's not of much use for value cache, but if we see that this will be required by some demanding applications, we will add this in the later versions. To my knowledge, there are already some works in this direction.
Yeah, good to know that we're kind of trying to future-proof this and maybe eventually implement a new type of cache or something like that. Thank you a lot. It was a real pleasure, really educational. But now we have to move on